he will never be a black man. Well, that's not for you to decide, okay? As some background for this conversation, we have Irrelevant. He does react content and review content where he goes through different debates or drama or things that are happening on the website and then gives his take on it. A lot of the time he's looking for, what do we have evidence for? How are we arriving at that evidence? How are we evaluating it? And I'm going to limit the conclusions that we can reach based on that evidence that we have access to. And the other interlocutor is Humongous. He's from the Destiny Discord. He does a lot of arguing on there. He's also appeared on both of the Naruto panel arguments that we've done. His position in this is pro-trans race. Before you laugh at it, try to give him a shot. Try to hear him out. You may have a knee-jerk response with why you think it should or shouldn't be a thing, but he may challenge your preconceived notions about that. He may show you that you don't have that thought out at the level that you would think, right? You may be offhandedly dismissing something that may be worth thinking a little bit more about.
I don't know if it would be a transracialist argument, but I'm willing to quote-unquote die on the hill of transracialism.
Okay.
Say like Rachel Dolezal, her identity is valid. So
okay.
I think the boundary between transgender and transracial is way thinner than some people realize. Yeah, and maybe that's something that will become clear to us as we go through this. For some people, they have not thought over transgender stuff very deeply, and they have not created like rules for why they accept transgender people. And for some of these people, they give trans people social consideration when they're speaking and engaging with them because of some vague amorphous thing that may also apply to the transracial thing. And though their knee-jerk response is to not validate the identity of transracial people, unfortunately, that's just a knee-jerk response. And if we look at it logically, like the same reasoning that they're using for being considerate of the identity of trans people should allow for the recognition and respect of transracial people as well. But it doesn't occur that way. And then it can be frustrating to see that. And in my opinion, like there are a lot of parallels here. Like one of the things that ContraPoints talks about in some of her coverage of trans things is the inclusion of this variable that we could call performance, right? Or what I would call passing. There's a passing thing. And in order to pass, you present yourself in a certain way, and you act a certain way, and you speak a certain way, and you do all these things that are creating an image for people that will pass in their mind.
I don't mean performance in the sense of pretending to be something you're not. I mean performance in the sense of everything you do, the way you style yourself, your posture, the way you speak. An authentic performance is just a habitual performance and nothing more than that.
This is a dimension to things that I think is like important to consider for both of these discussions. I think a lot of things for the everyday person that doesn't think about these issues at all comes down to passing. If they couldn't even tell that you were trans, if they couldn't clock you, they don't have this problem about calling you he or she or whatever, right? Because if you are a female in their eyes and they clock you as a female, they're going to use female pronouns out of habit, the same way they would with any cisgendered person. Race is not nearly as important, in my opinion, socially, as gender is, right? Because gender is so fixed into our language that like it is important, and you make a split-second decision as to what gender you think somebody is, whether you mean to or not, right? Because it's part of a lot of how English language works. I don't know about other languages, but I could speak for my own. I think that a lot of things come down to that, and I'm not sure we discussed that in this conversation. A lot of focus is on like whether or not we should validate this person's personal identity or whether or not we should play along with whatever they're presenting as. And I have to say that like this language makes me feel really uncomfortable. And I think it makes a lot of people feel really uncomfortable to see people revert to positions that seem very anti-trans on the surface in order to shut down people that are trans race, right? Some of the language about like, you want to pretend to be black so you could say the N-word. Like, do trans women pretend to be women so that they could wear a dress? Like, this is some really like weird phraseology that I think like when we look at an argument that runs parallel to it is incredibly uncomfortable and is incredibly strange. And I don't think you can help but to make these parallel connections when you're discussing this into a trans person that may be watching this, who is like rolling their eyes and cringing out at the fact that we're equivocating transgender to trans race. Like, you have to realize that the perspective of just a random person who's thinking about these concepts for the very first time, there are a lot of parallels here. There are a lot of parallels in how they reason to identify you by your gender and handle you in a social setting, and how those same principles should also then apply, we would think, to transracial people, right? A lot of the same arguments that we would use to take away the identity of trans people could also be used to take away the identity of transracial people, right? So like, this is the difficulty here. If you start to make knee-jerk reactions and knee-jerk arguments against the trans race thing, those same arguments could then just be reworded to be used against the gender thing. And unless you have a way to distinguish gender is an important thing versus race is an important thing, or something like that, it's going to be difficult. It's very tricky all around. And I'm not pretending like I have the answers to it or I know the ideal way to handle this conversation, because I really, really don't. If you get mad at me that I'm asserting one thing or the other, just know I'm not. I don't know. This is a very difficult thing. It's a very difficult argument to engage in, and I think that Hugh really likes these sorts of things.
Do you want me to just? I'm not really hard against transracialism. Do you want me to just tell you why I'm not for transracialism at the moment?
Sure, I think that'll be a lot faster instead of me just giving out a bunch of things.
For sure. So I think that my main point of contention why I'm I'm not really too sure about this transracialism stuff is primarily because one, it feels like it's typically only willed out in opposition to trans people, trying to be well, if you have to agree with this, you have to agree with this, which I don't think is true.
Why does that impact your decision as to what you think about a topic? I don't think that you should base your beliefs about something or whether or not you logically consider something based on the optics of how other people use that argument necessarily. I think that Irrelevant and Steven are like-minded in this way normally, where it's they're going to stick to what they believe in, what they have evidence for, what they've logically deduced themselves, irrespective of the social consequences of some of those conclusions. So it's interesting to see him wheel that out as a reason to not do that.
I think that anything that you can do as a black person, you can reasonably do as a white person, to the point where in which I would argue that it'd be very similar to being trans in regards to your gender, if gender stereotypes were almost entirely eradicated. That's where I'm at. It's what can you, my question typically for people that are transracial advocates is what can you not do as a white person that you could do as a black person or an Asian person?
I don't think this is true at all. He's saying that race is at the point of utopia that we aim to do with gender abolition. If in gender abolition we want to make it to where these two genders are not treated differently at all, and we accomplish that, I think that perfect universe actually exists today for race. What? Really? Do you really think that races are treated so equally that it can be compared to the ideal of gender abolition, that we have already achieved that on the racial side of things, such that you're not treated differently based on your race, so it doesn't matter what you identify as? This is really rough. I think he's talking about ability rather than social privilege, but we cannot separate those two things. They're hugely important. Your social privileges impact your ability to engage in particular ways. Black people are treated differently than white people all of the time. Asian people are treated differently than white people, and vice versa, right? Races are treated differently by people, and that is an immutable fact. If I gave you the question of what can you do as a woman that you can't do as a man, if we apply the same question to trans people, I feel this gets yikers really, really quick. I treat a lot of the questions that he's giving here as questions about somebody's identity. He wants to invalidate somebody. Let's be clear about this. So Rele's position here is that he wants to invalidate the personal identification of transracial people. He wants to invalidate them. If somebody on the other side were making these same arguments for somebody that was transgender, we would say the same thing, that you want to invalidate their gender expression. You want to invalidate how they're presenting themselves, right? And then you're giving arguments for why you should invalidate what they're saying about themselves. If this was a conservative person making the same arguments about transgender people, I think we would all be very, very upset with the way they're handling it.
Okay, so I'll try just both those things. For the second point, I'm not sure necessarily why it matters in regards to what you can't do in terms of self-identity.
Sure. So I'll substantiate that if you would like.
Sure.
Oh, sorry.
Sure.
Okay.
Go ahead.
One of the reasons why I hold trans movement in regards to gender pretty close to my heart is because there's very substantial material barriers that block you from being able to do things in your life autonomously, to think the way you want to autonomously, or be treated the way you want to based on your gender identity, either self-identification or presentation or what have you as well. Like, you are treated so radically different on the basis of your gender that I feel like, in regards to, not to say that you aren't necessarily because of your race, but I feel like the only reason why you typically are because of your race is because of whether or not you're passing, is one of the main reasons why. But we can get into the whole passing argument with that as well later.
Race and gender, they say, are different concepts. Race is about an inherited trait you obtain from your ancestors. No, it's not. It's not about what you get from your ancestors. A lot of it is about how you look. That's a huge dimension of it. I will not allow this discussion about race to be limited simply to what is inherited. I think a huge component of race is how you're identified by other people. And now, we could argue that both of those exist simultaneously as important. Your ancestry, how you were raised, the environment you grew up in, all of that. Yeah, we could put that in a box to the side as another important thing. But you need to identify and give me a little bit of ground that how you're presented, how you are clocked as, is another huge component of race. I don't look at somebody who I identify as white and imagine that they had an African American or black upbringing, or they had African American ancestry, right? But they very well could have. They very well could have been adopted by a black family in a black neighborhood and grown up black, and they could do all these things, and they could have an ancestry in their family now because they were adopted that hits all the marks for you, but it doesn't hit the marks for clockability. And I think that that's an important aspect of this. The aesthetic is an important aspect here, and I want to make sure that we have both of these boxes. I identify, validate, and recognize what you are saying with the culture and with the ancestry and all of that stuff. 110%, yes. But all I ask is that you also give me some ground here in identifying that the way that people perceive you is another huge component of this. You can identify somebody's race without knowing anything about them, right? And people do that all the time, the same way that people identify gender all the time, not based on what is in your pants, not based on a sexual organ that I can't see. It's based on other things, right? And that's the same arguments we use in defense of trans people.
Well, just one quick point. I just want to ask a clarifying question. Mm-hmm. So you just said, in regards to like the barriers that trans people face.
Yep.
So are you asserting that, like, for someone who is identifying as a quote unquote different race, or at least there is no barrier in regards to race in terms of behavior?
Well, yeah, I don't think that a white person can't do anything that a white person can listen to hip hop or whatever stereotype. Also, literally, this is a question that I typically have. It's a little bit more like, it's not very fruitful for the conversation, but like, generally speaking, whenever I ask somebody that's like pro-transracial, I would just like typically ask them, what is it that black people do? What makes a black person a black person? And then they're like stuck in this position where they kind of have to be racist. And I don't feel like you have to do that for men or women, right?
I don't think you have to do it for race either,
really?
or for men. I think it's sort of about, yeah.
Really? Okay, so then what do black people do?
It's what they do, whatever the group that identifies as black people do. I don't think.
No, I'm asking you what. Yeah, I'm asking you what the group of black people do. What does the group that identifies as black people? What do they do that me? Let's say I was white. That me as a white person would like to identify with that I couldn't do if I was white. What do they do?
Okay, I'm not sure if I'll disagree with this, but I think the same to hold to gender as well. I don't think men have to follow a certain set of behaviors.
I disagree. Yeah, this is where I disagree. I think a white dude that listens to hip hop or break dances, whatever the fuck you consider to be black, is going to take infinitely less negative repercussions than like me as a man that's, you know, trying to do, like, I don't know, wear a dress. Do you disagree with that?
Sure, but I don't think the scale of harm determines validity.
I will give Rele points here. So there is definitely a scale here. And I would agree that when we compare these two things, the social consequences of one versus the other, of engaging in stereotypically African American or black or whatever race you're choosing to be, there are less consequences. I would agree. But as Hugh is going to get into here, the scale, I could see how you don't care about the scale very much here. And then Rele is going to have to argue why it's important that we have this scale of harm thing. Hugh is not taking the route that I would personally take in the conversation with Rele here, but I have faith in Hugh as a debater. I have faith in Hugh as an argumentative force. So I'm interested to see where he takes this, even if it isn't the ideal way that I would take it.
I think it absolutely does, because if you run it down, let's assume that you are not in any way, shape, or form, like, there is no gender stereotypes whatsoever. So there is no conforming to any. Right. I would say at this point, it makes no sense to be trans. Because you can do whatever the fuck. Because at that point, gender doesn't exist.
Wait, well, to be clear, it's not, you can say it makes no sense, but then you wouldn't say someone who identifies as trans invalid. Right?
I would by definition, because it'd be like a tautology. It wouldn't mean anything. So if you would say you identify as a man. I would ask you, what does that mean? You would be like, nothing. I'd be like, okay, so do you want me to call you by certain pronouns? Sure, but like you might as well be saying I identify as bleh, because it means nothing.
So he's biting the bullet on like, no, I would invalidate a trans person if we lived in a gender abolition world. Like, I totally would. I would say that expression is invalid, because it doesn't make any difference. It's tautologically unimportant.
The only reason why gender matters, or any label matters, is because there's a material, we treat them a specific way. Okay. Correct?
Sure. So how about I give an example and you tell me how I can treat these two people differently?
Correct. Okay.
Okay, sure. So let's say we have two people. So they look the same. They're both white passing, right? Mm-hmm. Now one person, it has like black ancestry. So so he's biologically two black parents. But that other person's adopted by two black parents. But other than that, they live in the same exact household, same neighborhood, in the same culture, right? Let's say you're surrounded by
hold on.
black people.
I didn't quite keep up with the example. There's a person with black history or black ancestry, but they're raised by also black parents.
So we're creating a scenario where the box that we were talking about before, with all of the way you were raised and your culture and whatever, is identical. However, the presentation, your skin color, is different here.
Yeah. So like, the idea is, let's say, so
we just get a random white passing full black person. Is what you're saying?
So let's say we have a white passing black person and then just a regular white person, but let's say they look the same.
Yep.
So society will see them as the same, but they have the same heritage. Well, it's not the same heritage. Sorry, they have the same like history in terms of how they were raised, how they were treated.
I don't think they do. I already don't think that they do, because compared to a white person,
I said they look the same. So I said they look the same.
I know, but I think you have to take in the familial situation as well. I've had this conversation extensively with my chat, and when we're talking about what makes somebody white and what makes somebody black, it's twofold. One is your ability to pass inside of the environment, because if you pass, everyone's going to treat you that way, versus your like familial, how your family has been treated throughout their bloodline.
So his thing with black is there are two components to it. There is the passing part, how people identify you on the street, they clock you as being black. The other aspect is the history of your ancestors' oppression or the way that they were treated. It's only important insofar as how the culture is treating you today. By this argument, let's assume that we live in the world that Rele is talking about, where it's basically like gender abolition land, where the race has no impact on anything. Who cares if your ancestry was that? If it has no bearing on the way that people are treating you today, then it had no bearing on the way that you're raised. It's just a historical fact. Then how does that have any impact on you? If we solved racism, if I Thanos snap a solution to racism and nobody recognizes it or cares about it, it's not a distinguishing feature that anybody recognizes. What would it matter if there was history of discrimination in the past if it's not occurring in the present? I don't understand this. I don't think it connects very well with what he was saying earlier, but we'll see if Hugh points that out or not.
For instance, let's say I might pass as like white or whatever, right? Or I might pass as XYZ. Pass as Asian, whatever, right? I might pass as X, Y, and Z. However, my parents received a lot of discrimination on the basis of the way that they did, and that discrimination then informs the way that I live my life, whether I want it to or not.
Isn't this kind of tautological? You're basically saying black people are treated like black people?
Wait, how are you getting there?
I would have explained that a little bit more, Hugh, unless the plan was to get him to be confused and then to explain it to him. I would have given more information there, because it's not very clear to everybody watching what you mean.
In terms of like their family history, right? Like, if you don't share that history, the history of black people, you're not black.
No, I never
What-
said
what
that. No,
black
I never said that you're not black.
Okay, sorry,
But what I'm
go ahead.
saying, that's a component of being black.
Yeah, but it's only one of two components. You only named clockability and then the historical aspect of it. And it doesn't seem, based on the way that you're currently responding to the example he's putting forward with these two kids, that you even care very much about box number one with the passability thing. And you're giving a lot of weight to the historical thing. So I think he's right in focusing on this historical aspect, because it's what's important for Hugh to diffuse here. Hugh needs to diffuse box number two, the historical aspect of things, or reconcile it with how he thinks you should be treating transracial people. So for Hugh, I think this box number two is something he's going to focus on because it's an area of contention. Generally, if I want to make progress in an argument, I want to focus on the things that we agree about, the things we have consensus about. I think they both have consensus on box number one, the clockability thing, how you look. But he was going to focus on box number two because it's a debate and he wants to argue. And so the contention is on that second part, the ancestry part.
I wouldn't say that, like, I wouldn't discredit that. If somebody's white passing, but their entire family is black, I would say that, yeah, they're black because they have that also that measure of that. But I would not disagree that it's like a balancing act, and where you draw the exact line is completely ambiguous.
He's weighted these two things very differently from each other. He's weighted box number two much more than box number one. So box number two, this historical thing, is far more important to irrelevant than how you look or how you pass. But that's missing out on the fact that discrimination doesn't occur at the historical level. Discrimination occurs at the level of people you meet every day who are treating you differently. And I don't think he's giving any weight to that because he doesn't believe that that's the case in the real world. And I would say that most people that I would ask would agree that races are treated differently nowadays. So I think that's a contention that Hugh really needs to address here. Hugh is totally correct. You do only need one of these components to be black, because Rele just said that if the person doesn't pass as black, but they have all the historical things, he would still validate their expression or their self-identification as being black, purely because of the historical aspect of things. So when Irrelevant is posing the idea that to be black means to have two things, to pass as being black and to have a history or an ancestry, that's not true. Because we're finding out here that Irrelevant is saying, oh, of course I would still identify you as black if you didn't pass as black, because you still have all the ancestry. Well, then you don't have a two-part definition of being black. And this is what he was getting at when he mentioned that tautological comment. What he should have said was, you're giving me a two-part definition, but you're telling me that part one, the passing, the clockability, the way your skin looks, has no bearing on whether or not you define something as the word. Because when we presented a scenario where the skin color was different, but the history was the same, you still validated that identity. So you don't have a two-part definition here. And that's important to remember. Rele doesn't really have a two-part definition here. He only has a one-part definition. He's only looking at the history because the presentation could be anything and he still validates their identity as being black. I don't like the history thing. You could say the same thing about gender and how women have a specific history, but we don't tell trans women that they aren't women because of the lack of history. Yes, TERFs do. TERFs will say that women that didn't grow up being women and didn't undergo the things that women underwent should not be able to identify as women, right? That's one of their arguments that they pose, which is, again, why I have problems with the parallels here. I have problems when we use those same bad arguments to then make these things about race, because I'm not sure about that. Like, you could say that they're different, and I think that's as far as I would go. They're different experiences. To grow up as a woman and to be identified as a woman by everybody around you your entire life is, by definition, a different experience than transitioning later on in life and then living as a woman. I know that that may seem like cringe. You guys may be upset at that, but that is a fact. Like, they are different. Is one more valid than the other? No, I don't think that at all. Should one mean that you're more of a woman than the other? No, I don't think that at all. But they are different, and how you reconcile those differences or what you think those differences are, that's where the debate comes in. That's where you debate about things, right? What are the consequences of this difference, if any? We need to talk about that a little more here. I'm interested to see where this ends up going.
Okay, so do I need just one of these components to be black?
No, I mean, I feel like it's arbitrary, but you could deal with only one of them, yeah.
Okay, so if I just look black, but I have no black heritage, no black family whatsoever, I'm still black.
That's clever of Hugh. So we have two parts to this definition, and he asked very broadly, and I didn't catch that in the very beginning. He asked very broadly, so do I only need one of these things to then meet your definition? And Rele, thinking we're talking about the second part of that definition, the ancestry and whatever, agrees, says yes. And then he goes, okay, I know you're thinking about number 2, but if only number 1 exists, then can we say the same thing?
Not necessarily. It depends. Like, I would say it absolutely depends on like the environment or what have you.
But that's box number 2. That has nothing to do with the presentation thing, the passing is black thing, which is explicitly what you said for your part 1 of the definition.
Let's say you look black, but nobody treats you as though you're black because everybody knows that your like family isn't black and that you're not actually like black genetically. Then you wouldn't really be treated as though you're black.
So it's not about whether you look black, it's if you're treated black, which I feel like are very, very different things, to the point where we may as well not mention whether or not somebody looks black at all in part 1 of our definition. My advice to Rele would be to edit your definition to be number 1, if they are treated as black, whatever that means, and number 2, they have the ancestry of being black. Do not include anything about whether they pass as black, because this pass as black thing has to do with how they look. It doesn't have to do with how people treat them, really. I think we should be more specific there to get out of that area.
I don't care on parallels like trans people, because I feel like there's a lot of comparisons here. Sure,
you can find parallels sure, if you want to. But my thing is primarily based on the treatment, like, my thing is the actual, like, if you are a full white person and you say, I want to identify as a black person, right? Or what have you. I don't think you have the same grounds as, like, a trans person when it comes to gender. I don't think you do because of the difference in treatment.
Okay, so with Dolezal, right?
Sure.
She passed as black, okay? And I think she passed because no one... Well, no. So the reason I say that, no one ever questioned her being black until...
Sure, okay.
Let's be really, really clear here. You can't take that away from her, even if Rele really wants to, because it would help his argument here. You can't take that away from her. She passed as black for a long time before this whole thing came out about her being trans race, right? Like, that was the whole thing behind there being a huge public outcry about this lady, was that she came out with, like, I used to be this way, and I chose to live a life as this other thing.
We can look at her now and try to, like, really clock her, but... Clearly, no one called her out for being white until way later.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
Okay, so wait, under what so why the hell would we ever say, oh, she can't do that? Like, so is it causing harm? Is it like a problem? Is it not well? Like, what's the issue?
So the only reason why I would say is just like, why? There doesn't seem to be a good reason. Like, why?
This is super important. So Hugh asks, why would we invalidate her expression? Why wouldn't we allow her to identify as this thing? What is the problem there? And Rele hits him back with the, no, you. No, my question to you is why? Why would we want to treat her like that? This is where I start to have a problem with Rele's engagement in this conversation, is I don't think this is very fair to Hugh here. Hugh asked you a specific question. Hugh gave you answers on your specific question, but you're going to hit him with the no you here by asking him the exact same thing back. Like, I don't know if this is a fair way of handling the conversation.
Why does there need to be a reason?
I think there has to be a reason. Well, yeah, sure. Because I don't think that I don't have to respect somebody's XYZ if there is no good reason. Again, the parallels that we can make to the transgender discussion. If I don't see any compelling reason to treat you like a woman when you were raised as a man, then, why do I got to treat you as a woman? Like, this is rough for me. She can do all of the shit that she did as a white person, and in fact, probably be better off for it than if they were a black person. So, like, I don't understand why. Why is she better off for it, though? This is, like, contrary to the narrative you're trying to spin with there's no difference between doing things as a white person or as a black person. But I know that you know better than that, which is why you're saying, like, if anything, she would be better off. Why would she be better off doing all those things as a white person? You have an understanding of these race relations, so I feel like you should know better than the way that you're engaging with this. The disconnect with, like, trans people, in my opinion, is, like, trans people typically cannot do whatever they want to do. Now, if we lived in a world in which, like, people treated you exactly the same or pretty similar to the same when on the basis of your gender, I wouldn't give a fuck about, like, people's gender identity almost at all. Enjoy your
okay, I actually could give you examples of good reasons.
Okay.
Although this is mostly focused and it's not really a study. I looked up papers on it, but I couldn't really find any good study on it.
Okay.
In regards to transracial adoptions.
Yep.
So it's pretty well documented the history of, or like, the problems these kids face.
Yep.
So let's say you're an Asian kid raised in a white household, you suffer like, a lot of times. Oftentimes when they start becoming a teenager, they get these really weird. I won't call dysphoria because that seems kind of weird to call it that. Sure. But they can experience lots of issues with gender identity. Mm-hmm. And so like again, because they always identified with their parents, but now like they're realizing, oh shit, wait, I'm different. So if those people, if that Asian kid wanted to identify as white, it seems like they have really good reason to. Like, what's the issue there? Like,
so
why would is there any reason to not respect it?
Right. So I think in that circumstance, like I would again, like what does that solve?
Hugh is being very fair in responding to the questions that he's being given. And I don't feel like Irrelevant is being equally fair in responding to the questions that Hugh is giving. And Rele is being an obstacle in this conversation, a way that he really doesn't need to be. If Rele is convinced and very confident that these trans race people always fall apart when he asks questions, or always falls apart when they have these arguments, or their position doesn't make sense, why is there a problem with engaging in Hugh's line of questioning here, which he's not doing? This is the second time in a row that he's hit Hugh's question with another question rather than actually answer what's going on here. Now, Hugh did this at the very, very beginning, but then they actually got to some answers. So let's hope that that's similar for Rele here, where he's dodged on both of these, but we're going to get a response after this, hopefully. I hope.
Wait, what do you mean solve?
What does it solve? What is that trying to, why? Because because like you're stating that the good reason is because this individual feels disenfranchised in regards to like not disenfranchised, but like there's a disconnect with like their parents and them, correct?
So well, for example, let's say someone kept calling out and saying, hey, I don't care what you say, you're an Asian, shut the fuck up. If someone kept doing that over and over, like, do you have no ground to say, get the fuck away from me, I'm white, just respect that and leave me alone?
No, you can do. Okay, so what do you mean you don't have grounds for it? Because when we're talking about not having grounds, we're talking about. So let's rephrase it. Do I think it would be right for that individual to say so? Not necessarily, because like in my opinion, that's them just ignoring what I would consider to be the reality of their ethnicity.
Is Hugh going to make a parallel to transgender people here? Well, you're just denying your biological truth. Like, let's see where Hugh goes from here.
Let's assume every single individual like decides to say, you know what, I'm not Asian anymore. It's not like Asian people no longer exist, like, or right?
What do you mean the reality of it?
Well, so the reality, right. So the reality is that certain people look like X. I'm assuming we're talking about in regards to looks.
Sure.
Okay, so in reality, these certain people look like X. So one of my arguments against like people just saying like I identify as X or Y or Z, I feel like you ignore the material conditions of these people to be able to that like essentially brought them to that place in the first place. So like,
but I just don't see why. So okay, so I'm going to keep bringing it back, and I'm so sorry about this. I just don't see why it matters. For example, regardless of how I look, right? Let's say I don't pass as whatever I identify. Yeah. Why did that determine identification? So why does societal treatment determine identification?
Because I would consider that race as a social construct is built off of those things.
Yeah, but you don't nearly care about that as much as you care about the historic part, which we've already kind of established. So I don't think it's good to switch back when it's convenient for you here, Rele.
You can deny the aspect of race and say you want to abolish race. I'm down with that. However,
in your community, you can be. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so however, I think that denying it and saying that it doesn't exist in X, Y, or Z capacity, or like what have you, or the underlying things that people use it, just seeks to, in my opinion, make it more confusing to deal with the systemic issues that certain races of people face.
The same way that having people that are biologically men identify as women and dress as women makes things confusing, or like the systemic issues that men or women face. Like, I can't help but make the parallels to the transgender thing, because a lot of these arguments fall flat or are disallowed when we're talking about transgender stuff. And if I'm really going to give Rele all this ground, or you believe in everything that Rele is saying here, I would be really interested in how you reconcile that with your beliefs about trans people. Because unless you're making exceptions to your rules for trans people, like, I don't see how these things can like coexist at the same time.
You're saying that the idea of like someone identifying as a race other than
well, it's just like you can't. It's like the same thinking. So a lot of the process that people like TERFs, for instance, go through when it comes to trans people is like, why can't we? Because this is actually an argument for you. Why don't trans people? Why don't trans people just? Why do trans people feel a need to have an identity at all, a gender identity? Why don't they just all become non-binary or just not identify with any gender? That's my question for you, genuinely.
Well, like why don't they?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. That's just saying why not. Like, odds are I do something, I have a preference, and it's a valid preference. I don't need a reason to have a preference. I don't need a reason to, say, prefer chocolate.
So that's the direction he's going to go. That all of this could be deduced down to preferences, and that they have a preference to be identified or to present as one way versus the other. And ultimately, this comes down to preferences. That's how he's going to put forward here. An interesting move from him here. It's not at all what I would predict that he would do. I mean, gender dysphoria is like a kind of very, very intense preference. No. Let's be more specific here, Zapdot. It's not that that is a preference, that is a reason in the framework that we have here. Hugh is saying these things could be a preference, irrespective of reasons. And Rele is saying if you have a preference, there ought to be a reason for this preference, and you should know and be well aware of what that reason is. So in that case, to slot in what you're mentioning here with dysphoria, the dysphoria is not a preference. The dysphoria is a reason to have a preference, right? Because it would be preferable to not experience dysphoria compared to experiencing it by being a gender that you don't want to be.
This is the disconnect, in my opinion. When people talk about this, when I say like you don't need a reason to be trans or what have you, I'm talking about it in the context of the way that we live our life right now, right? I think that you do need a reason to do whatever the fuck you want to do in general, not for me to know, but for you to know and the reasons why it happens, right? And what have you.
Well, that's an important principle to have. So you need to have a reason that you know for every decision that you make. Okay. To be quite honest with you, I don't even expect people to have reasons for arguments they put forward in a debate, because I just don't have a very high bar in my brain for the way that normal people engage with ideas or thoughts. I think that a lot of people, myself included, with most topics, we kind of just do things. I don't think we're reasoning through a lot of the things that we choose to do day to day. Or if we are, it's at a subconscious or unconscious level. I think preferences can exist independent of like known reasons for those preferences. I think a preference can exist for a preference's sake, but Rele is not comfortable with that. And Rele has created a rule for the universe that every decision should have reasons known to the person making the decision. So Rele has created an artificial rule here for the way that things ought to work. He was going to have to either choose to fit in with that or not be able to convince Rele here. They're both surprising me with things that they're doing now, which I guess is better than disappointing. So I guess we'll see where this goes. I don't know how these two Beyblades are going to like fight each other. I have no idea like what the interaction between these two things is going to be. They've both pulled out positions that haven't really occurred in the conversation yet. Let's see where this goes.
In a world where in which there was no gender stereotypes whatsoever and gender did not exist, why would you be trans? Or how could you, I would ask, how could you be trans?
Okay, so just quickly, so what you just said there, so you said gender stereotypes don't exist.
There is no gender. There is no gender. There is nothing associated with the genders whatsoever. They're completely and totally vacuous and meaningless. Why would you be trans?
Sure. Well, it depends on how you feel about gender. If you think gender is purely socially constructed, then there is no reason. For race, if there was no ideas of race, like if no one ever thought about race, I actually would agree with you. Race completely wouldn't exist. Race is a pure social construct. Well, at the very least, of my conception of gender, there is some inherentness to it, some process inside that manifests because of stereotypes and culture and all that stuff into gender. I don't know if you would say there's an internal gender, but there is something. So I don't know how that would present in a world of no stereotypes.
He was appealing to some like amorphous thing that might exist in people that alongside the catalyst of social expectations and stereotypes comes out and expresses itself in terms of a gender. And he's saying that this thing that he can't explain that exists within a person that pushes them in one direction or another depending on those societal factors, he's not sure how that thing inside of the person would behave absent those pressures or absent those stereotypes. So he's appealing to something that he doesn't know exists here. So I'm not sure if this is like super solid ground unless he explains it better. And if Rele calls him out on this, we could give a lot of pushback here. But if the bar for a something being a reason is too low, it kind of becomes useless or meaningless, no? Sure, but it's useless or meaningless to you. But if it's useless or meaningless to you, then why then did you choose to remove that person's identity or invalidate it from them, right? So let's assume that we live in the perfect universe that Irrelevant has constructed where we have abolished gender. If I chose to identify as a man, like, sure, you could say that my choice is meaningless. Sure. And I could agree with you in this hypothetical, maybe. Then why would you invalidate my decision? Would it be equally meaningless for you to invalidate my decision about my gender, since my decision about my gender is by itself meaningless? Like, then your decision to counter that thing seems to also be meaningless or fruitless. But then Rele would say, well, the reason that I'm criticizing it is because you don't have a reason to do that thing. And if I said that my reason was because it feels better for me to identify as this thing or because I want to, I wonder if that would be a good enough reason. But Hugh hasn't put forward that as like a response quite yet.
For example, let's say we live in a world, right, where like, let's say we have no history of trans people. So we never ever heard of a trans person before, right?
Yeah.
And that we can still conceive of like a trans person can like so someone can still have gender dysphoria or something. Someone can still identify as a different gender. And why? So that wouldn't make sense if the society believes in a strict gender binary. If they believe like sex and gender are the same thing. But again, we historically thought that, but people were still going against it naturally. So if it's purely social, then we would assume that wouldn't have happened.
Wait, why? Why would we assume that wouldn't have happened?
So again, if people are taught that your sex is your gender 100%,
yep,
and they've never ever heard of something else, so anything that contradicts that, right? Now how could someone feel that they are a different gender unless there is some internal thing guiding to that? Because that wouldn't be coming from some source.
Because we still had these social things, Hugh. That's the thing, is we still had social expectations and social stereotypes and things surrounding both of the genders, even back when sex was very, very, very rooted to gender. I think that would be the proper response here.
It's because there is two separate phenomenons at play. It's the same. So I feel like I'm running over the same arguments that I have with a lot of conservatives. You could call it what you want. We could call it manif if you want. But there's a phenomena that is attached to sex arbitrarily, which is if you are born in X sex, you do Y thing, otherwise you are scrutinized. And it is completely arbitrary. And that is exactly what people did with gender. They were like, hey, there is, well, I mean, gender was used at one point for that, but like, let's assume before there was even a word for it, right? Like what your example gave. There wasn't a word for it. Let's just assume sex. They go, hey, sex, that exists. And then they're like, well, there's this weird social situation that's going on in collaboration with sex. Let's create a word for that. Like, I don't know what you mean. It's still socially constructed. It just didn't have a word for it.
So, a lot of questions. Do you think like people in the future, if there was no gender, would it have body dysmorphia, for example? It's like
no, I imagine they certainly would. I imagine body dysmorphia would probably still happen. It just wouldn't be in line with gender. It would just be simply, I want to be like X, or I envision myself as X, and it causes me massive mental detriment, or what have you. But it would have nothing to do with gender.
Okay. I have trouble conceiving of an idea where like society would have absolutely no gender stereotypes. Because I think people who do relative, quote unquote, similar things will end up conglomerating into some kind of group anyway. I don't think gender. Like, I think gender now is socially enforced. But I don't like. I think the way it developed was also probably somewhat natural, right?
Well, now you're arguing with like the validity of the entire hypothetical, right? And I'm not sure if that's helpful to say, well, I can't even imagine a world where we don't have this. Well, work your imagination harder, buddy. We're meant to accept that this is a hypothetical and then work within that hypothetical world. But now you're going to challenge the validity of the entire hypothetical world that Rele has constructed here.
I think we would just end up getting new gender things instead of that may not be relevant to the past conceptions of gender, or maybe to get more. But I don't know if you ever get to zero.
Right, sure. So we may not ever get zero or what have you, but like this may be on the same level of like talking about like what about otherkin? How do you treat otherkin? How do you treat otherkin? I'm actually curious.
So what do you mean? I treat
like yeah. Do you know what otherkin is?
Well, no, I know. Like what they identify as like different species.
Yeah. Well, how do you treat the? Do you think that those people are just as valid as like trans people when it comes to gender?
This is tough for you here. We could create a spectrum of validity on which we place like gender pretty high so that we match with all the woke points and we include trans people and we do all the good things we're supposed to do. We could put trans people really high on the validity tier list. We could put race, trans race, lower than that. And then we could put otherkin lower than that even still, right? The thing is, if he does do that and then he gives a metric for the validity, like I think it's more valid because of X and Y and Z, then perhaps some of that X or some of that Y or some of that Z are points that when Rele is talking about whether or not I play into whatever somebody is claiming that they are, it's based on these societal things, right? Can you do things that are different? Are you discriminated against? Does it make it harder to do? These are his metrics for like assigning validity to these different categories and playing along with how people want to identify. So if they could reconcile some of these metrics for validity and they can realize what are the different things we're looking for to assess validity here, and then they can agree or disagree on those individual things, maybe that's a way to progress the conversation forward here.
And I feel like the transgender thing is more valid only because I believe in there's some inherent component. But honestly,
wait, why?
Logically speaking, no.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but logically speaking, like so that I intuitively think it's not the same, but logically I think it is probably somewhat comparable.
That's a fair answer. So logically, yeah, what you put forward so far, you are kind of stuck there. Even if at a knee-jerk feel level, you want to create some kind of distinction to allow for these other two things that you feel are more valid than this third thing.
Right, so I compare otherkin to like being a fan of something is how I'd say it. It's like, it's in that you feel a connection with this given like label or identity or what have you. And the same way, like I would say that like me being a Mets fan or something like that could potentially get to like that point where I have like an obsession.
Okay, so rather than talking about the individual things they use to determine the metric, he's going to add another item onto that spectrum to give you a better idea of like, where are we on this validity scale? Well, if I want to give you another landmarker so we know how far on that validity spectrum we are, I think this is hovering real close to like being a fan of something.
I think we can make a distinction between being a fan of something to identifying as that thing. I think there's a distinction there.
Identifying as a fan is a form of identity.
Oh, no. What I mean is like, so being a fan of something versus identifying as that thing. So like saying I'm a fan of like basketball versus I am basketball.
I mean, what is the meaningful distinction there, in your opinion?
Oh, are we really one-to-one comparing them? Because we probably shouldn't do that. That doesn't make any sense. They're not the same. Other can believe that they are this other thing. They're not like, I really like wolves. Like, they think that spiritually at some level they are this other thing. They have a spiritual connection to that at an identity level. It's not that they're a fan of it. These two things are very, very different.
You're identifying as the entity that is a fan of something.
We recovered. So yeah, let's go back to clarifying that we're simply adding another bullet point onto this spectrum to better understand where otherkin would fall on like validity of identity or importance of identity on that spectrum. Okay, let's try to focus there. Let's not equivocate these two things at any kind of logical or nuts and bolts level, because we probably shouldn't. You can equivocate them in terms of like how much validity you give to the identity or how important you think it is, but let's not like apples and orange them the way that Hugh just wanted to.
Well, yeah.
You understand when you identify with, you understand when people are otherkin, they don't literally say that they are a deer, right?
No, they do. Some other can believe their identity derives from reincarnation, trans-species dysphoria of the soul, ancestry, or metaphor. I think metaphor is the only part that gives ground where Rele is assuming it here. Others attribute it to unusual psychology and do not hold spiritual beliefs on the subject. So none of these, though, are like they're a fan of the creature. Besides the metaphor thing. Like the metaphor thing is the only thing that comes close to that. So I'm not sure.
They aren't saying that I literally am a deer. I have the anatomy of a deer. They identify with the aspects or the idea of a deer.
It sounds like they feel a deep connection to that thing, not just like they share aspects. I think it's deeper than the way that he's explaining it here, if I'm being honest.
Like, I don't think someone who like saying like identifies as a woman, like, oh, I 100% have a woman's body 100%, but I identify with that, and I would like that. I'm sorry, you bring it back to... The reason why I brought it to otherkin instead of bringing it to gender is because I think there are hierarchies of identification when it comes to whether or not, like, for instance, the accessibility for somebody to be able to, live their life autonomously outside of it.
So Hugh is just missing the point of this entire thing. Hugh is missing what we talked about, where we're on a spectrum and we're describing different items on that spectrum and how they compare to each other. So Hugh just missed the entire reason that Rele is bringing up these points. That explains why he's confused, why he's trying to make direct comparisons between these things. So Hugh is messing up here.
If anybody were to say that they're a fan of anything, do you think that I am morally obligated to respect them to be able to say that they're like a Batman fan? Do you think I'm morally obligated to do that?
I don't have a problem with morally. I'll say like if you say, well, no, you're a fake fan, you're probably just a dick. But also, what if I just simply don't right? So my whole point is like at some point identification of a given entity becomes so vacuous in people's day-to-day life, meaning that it matters and manifests so little in people's like well-being that I just don't think I have a moral obligation to continue with it.
I don't know a lot of other kin people, but I would imagine that probably taints a lot of their interactions with people. Although a random person off the street that has no idea that that's what's going on in their head or in their soul, if that's what you believe about it. If they didn't know that, maybe they don't treat them differently. But the moment they start talking to them and this person is appealing to these ideas that they have the spirit of a wolf or these things, maybe that is seriously coloring the way that they're interacting with people, though. So I'm not sure. I think you were closer when you said that like the validity that you assign to people's different identities personally from your own perspective is what this spectrum is. But to then make a parallel to like how they're treated in the real world, I'm not sure if your spectrum aligns with that necessarily.
To bring it over to your example, gender absolutely could get to a point where in which it's so fucking meaningless inside of society that I don't even have to recognize it because it could be the same as saying I'm a fan of Batman. It is so right. Did you agree with that?
Yes, but you recognizing it is what we're asking. Like, if I told you I was a fan of Batman, why would you reject that? You would reject that because you say, who cares? I don't give a fuck that you're a Batman fan. What does being a Batman fan mean anything nowadays? Nobody gives a fuck what you're a fan of. Let me tell you that right now. And because nobody gives a fuck, I'm not fucking identifying you as a Batman. I'm not playing in your fucking fantasy. I don't give a fuck that you identify as a Batman fan. I'm not down with it. You're not a Batman fan. That's very, very different than just saying it doesn't matter very much. There's a difference between saying it doesn't matter very much and I'm going to reject that identification that you have given yourself. We're asking why you would reject the identification. And I think that it might be worthwhile for Hugh to focus on that here. If Rele is allowed to get away with this framing, we're going to move away from that. And I really think that's the question that we want to focus on here.
Okay, from your perspective, if I'm getting it right, if I'm getting it right, I know where you're coming from. So it seems like your idea is if there is like no real harm that can come out of misidentifying, it's not a very important identity, it's not something that has lots of practical implications, then there is no real moral weight to it.
Yeah, well, there is not very much, moral prescription that would be necessary to be able to compel somebody to do it. Yeah.
Well, let's try to be specific. Compel a person to validate that identity, that expression, right? It's the validation that we want to probably focus on here.
I don't know if I'm arguing more. I'm arguing about it's like valid.
Right. So wait. By this argument, every single thing is valid. Like when it comes to your emotions and yourself.
No. So what we're guys is like, for example, like someone will say, "Oh, the person again." It's like I'll agree for Rachel. We'll say Dolezal, right? oh, she was impersonating black people, right? She was like a fake black person. Like, so they're not even, there's no, the issue there isn't even necessarily the moral one, is that they're saying explicitly she is not that. She is invalid. Right?
Wait.
It sounds like you're saying you just don't care.
I mean, I don't. Well, yeah, I'm not trying to make the. Yeah, I correct. I would say that, like, in general, that I don't consider these things to be very real and rigid boxes. I mean, these are very arbitrary boxes, especially when we talk about race. Like, what makes a black person black, right? So I'm not going to make the hard claim that, like, there is no reality wherein which somebody can have a different definition of race than me that Rachel Dolezal can fit into, for sure. I'm just talking about whether or not we are morally compelled to recognize Rachel Dolezal as black or what have you, and I just don't think we have to be. However, I would make the prescription that we are morally compelled to recognize the gender with which trans people identify as.
This is a good clarification from him. So we're morally obligated to validate the identity of these people. We're not to these people. Is being an asshole immoral? Because maybe you're not being immoral, but you're certainly being an asshole. And in my opinion, I think moral people tend not to be assholes. I mean, maybe that's a separate discussion, but I think you're an asshole if you just deny people their identity all the time.
On the basis of that exact same sliding scale as I previously mentioned, I think on the scale from transgender, right, gender more specifically, and being trans in regards to gender, to I'm a fan of the Mets, I think identifying with a race is way, way closer to the Mets than it is gender.
I will give points to Rele here. You were doing a very good job of making that initial point much more clear to him.
It's very close to getting to, hey, I want to identify as black. Dude, you're just, all that means to me is you're a fan of, like, The Flash. That's all that means to me. That doesn't matter.
So do you think the gender thing, so again, so as you said before, in a society which doesn't care about gender at all, then you wouldn't really care about the whole gender dynamic.
Correct.
Like, it's
go ahead.
Okay, so carry on. So if the people, okay, so even though we can agree race may not have race may not, let's say, completely limit your actions, right? Or a white person, like, they can do anything he wants, even if they're not black. So sure, but if there's harm, right, caused by denying it, we see that that's a reason to not deny it.
Oh,
so
yeah, for sure. So I would say potentially, yeah, for sure.
Oh, he's paving the way. Oh, I hope this lands. He's trying to establish that, okay, well, let's say that the identification working in a positive way, let's set that aside, not talk about that for a second, but let's say that the denial of that person's identification causes harm. This isn't responding to what Rele is saying with the spectrum thing, but this may be a strategic thing where if we can get some ground here, this may be better for his overall argument.
If I have reason to believe somebody's, like, going to kill themselves if I don't call them black, I'll call them black. Who cares?
Oh, well, no, but my point is, I feel like this is the same reason you are in defense of, like, transgender people. It seems like it's the same thing where, like, because of the harm that's caused, not necessarily because of the category.
Well, yes, correct. That's exactly correct. I
understand that. So, like, but there is no distinction between these. Like,
no, there is, because
it's the harm caused by
right. But the harm that it causes is based on the societal situation that they are both found in.
Not necessarily. If there was still dysphoria in a world where, like, gender was abolished, like, people could still feel incredibly uncomfortable that you're rejecting what gender they choose to be, even if society itself doesn't bully them for being one way or the other. Like, in this gender abolished world, if you chose not to use the right pronouns for trans people that wanted to identify as whatever gender they wanted to identify as, you're still causing harm in spite of the fact that there is no societal, like, things giving pressure to things being one way or the other. So no, this is actually an important thing that he was drawing here. And I like that he's limiting it to irrelevance actions and decisions here. That irrelevance decision to reject somebody's personal identification could cause them harm, independent of how society treats them or independent of the stereotypes associated with whatever that identification thing is. That there is harm that could be done independent of all the societal stuff simply by Rele rejecting the identification. And if that's a compelling enough reason for Rele to play along with whatever they claim it to be, that's actually a good direction to take this. Let's see how this goes.
Right? Again, I'll say it. a white person doing anything that's considered black is, they can do whatever they want. They can, like, can you name me three, like, this is typically where it gets a little bit bad faith or whatever, some shit like that, but like, I just want to say, can you name me three things that are black things to do that a white person would want to do?
Oh, he's going to go back. He's going to go back to the society thing.
There's one thing a white person can't do: identify as black.
Sure.
Sure. So like, there you go. That's one.
Well, no,
thing a white
but
person
then
can't do.
My whole meme is like, the reason why you would want to identify with anything is because there is a you find that there is a preference with that identification, correct? There is something about that new identification, right? And so what I'm asking
maybe you identify with that quote unquote experience. Maybe you identify with that experience so much that you want to like say, "Hey, I am with this. I am part of it."
Okay, what do you identify with that experience that you can't identify with it outside of it? Because a lot of the things that are intrinsic to the black experience that you might identify with is probably, a lot of it can be identified with if you're white or what have you.
Now we loop back to the very beginning of this conversation.
Unless we're talking about it like a black passing white person who like we're talking about the black passing white orphan or whatever and shit like that. Of which, like, of course, but like in 99, my whole meme is 99% of the time the individual that wants to, you know, identify as black or what have you, darkens their fucking skin, curls their hair up, speaks in a specific way that's just ends up being racist. That's all it is. It's like you could have done all of that shit as you were white, but in fact, I would say it makes it more like more racist. The fact that they're just like, hey, you know what? I'm black to do this. Like, you didn't have to be black to do this. It comes a lot off, especially. I don't know. Maybe I'm speaking too much for black people, but for me as a black person, it feels a lot like people are like, hey, I'm going to do crime, so I'm going to identify as like black people. You could have done that as when you were white. Or like, hey, I like hip hop, I'm going to identify as black. You could have done that when you were white. Like, and you would have received no negative societal repercussion.
Rele really misses the point here. It's not about what you can do, but in what spaces you can feel acceptance. To be fair to Rele, that's not a point that Hugh has made at all, right? The only thing that Hugh has given to respond to Rele's question here thus far has been the self-identification as the race itself as one of the things. You could say he's missing the point, but Hugh has not made this point super clear.
This is completely disanalogous from trans people. If I, as a man, right now want to go and wear a dress, I'm fucked. It's like, good luck, 07, fucking to that shit. I'm going to get so much fucking shit online, so much shit from people inside of my family, IRL. But if I'm a white person listening to hip-hop, that's just every fucking white person. Or whatever, right? Name any black activity, you're a white person, you're either better off for it or you're exactly the same. So I don't think that, like, I just don't consider these things to be the same situation. Maybe in the future, when we balance the gender scales a little bit better, sure. But like, as it stands right now, nah, no shot.
Well, no. So again, so to be clear, I understand you're saying they're not different, and the implications of both are very, very different. One clearly has a way worse implications in terms of the harm it can cause and the importance they have in our society. I do not disagree with you on any of those points.
Yeah.
But again, it seems like, and you maybe, and I get you're not doing this, but a lot of people will make this argument. Because again, so if it's not valid, I don't have to respect it, and I can just make fun of you for it because you're just being a dipshit LARPer, right? Who's trying to like trying to quote unquote wear our oppression or whatever it's called. This, I mean, Turfs will say, and also something what people said about Dolezal.
I'm not gonna talk about wearing like oppression. That's not really something I feel like I'm getting at.
Be careful with that projection onto Rele, because he's not going to let you just get away with it. He's going to point out that I have a difference of opinion from that. That's not what I'm saying at all.
Because we will say because of the quote unquote, you have no reason to do this. They'll then say, oh, it's not valid. Therefore, I'm free to ridicule you about it because you are in the wrong now.
Yeah, I wouldn't ridicule people about it. I just would say that, like, I don't have to respect somebody's transracialism. Because that white kid or whatever the fuck could have done whatever the fuck they wanted to do while being white and shit like that. And I don't think that I don't think it doesn't meet my threshold for having a threshold for having a moral obligation to do so.
I'm starting to develop some Voshism, dude. I think we need a supererogatory here. I think we need a supererogatory. You don't have to. You are not morally obligated to, but I would prefer that you do. Sure, you're not morally obligated to identify their thing but I would prefer that you did. The same way, if somebody says they're an anime fan, why the fuck would you say they're not an anime fan? Well, because being an anime fan actually has no impact on how you would live your life and everyday life. So I don't think I should be morally obligated to have to play along with this person's self-identification as a weeb. I don't think that's important. On a scale of things, I think gender and these other things that I'm morally obligated to do are over here, but this way over here. So I'm just not going to respect it. You seem to arbitrarily be rejecting that person's identity, though, and you're just rejecting it because you think it's less important. But just because it's less important doesn't mean you reject it, right?
I could be convinced otherwise, but it just, like, in 99% of cases, I feel like it's just white people that want to like watch too many hip-hop music videos and then want to be black. And it's like, I just don't care to substantiate.
Okay, so the problem, so I think, and again, it's one issue where, like, we're kind of focusing on, like, white people trying to be black. But to be clear, this can apply to any race.
I know. An issue is whenever everybody talks about race, it's always like white versus black, not really encompassing every group. This is going to include like white people to Asian people to black people, whatever, right? Native American people to Asian people.
Because like I feel like there's like a underlying thing where it's like, oh, a lot of these people who are doing it are just kind of misguided and they're trying to get away from maybe some racist bullshit. Does it feel like there might be something underlying it?
Well, I mean, some people might do that. I mean, that's a possibility.
No, sure, but I guess so. That's a common, what do you call it?
The retort to it.
Referenced. Yeah, we're saying like, it's just racist white people.
I know he's downplaying it now, and it's maybe not what he wants his argument to be, but he has presented numerous times that he thinks that the trans race thing just comes down to people wanting to live racist caricatures of black people. So he was going to let him off the hook here, but I pick up what you're putting down, Hugh. Like, I get where you're coming from, even if he's not going to play along with it. I think we've seen what we're going to see out of this conversation, and I'm kind of over it. I'm going to take a rain check. I think that's how you use that word. Hugh, while being a kind of frustrating debater, actually like challenges you in like a way that a lot of these debate people think that they want to be challenged, right? Like, if you make your whole thing about debating with people, arguing with people, playing in this playground of ideas, like, I would imagine that you yearn for somebody who's able to challenge you on positions like at a level that really makes you reconsider things, and to miss an opportunity to do that, it seems sad. Because if I made my whole thing debating, like, I think it would be interesting to hit somebody who's like challenging it in a real way. And I just don't think that Rele gave him the opportunity to do that. Rele kind of had a preconceived like notion of how things ought to be, and he kind of pushed that the entire time and didn't really move with Hugh on a lot of stuff. The very beginning, I don't feel like Irrelevant was being super helpful in the conversation. I feel like he was the biggest roadblock here. Even by the end, he doesn't really move his position at all or show any kind of like care that was given to Hugh's perspective here, which is kind of disappointing because I like Relevant. There are certainly problems with Hugh optically and rhetorically and the way he comes off. So with Hugh, that's a difficult thing that we'll have to address as well. The unique way he speaks, where he has these like stutters and lulls and then a lot of speech at once, and then stutters and lulls and then another giant chunk of speech at once. It makes it very difficult to listen to him at fast speeds. And I kind of realized this trying to review the conversation before I came on stream to look at it. And that may be something worth thinking about or working on. I'm fairly well aware of the plight of people with stutters, so I'm not throwing rocks at these people, but I will say that like, if you want to continue doing things in front of people, and if you want to be a public speaker, these are things that are worthwhile to focus on, right?
Wow, oh, wow, that's cool. Wow, what the fuck?